Welcome to our webinar today. This is a roundtable discussion on the future of global utility mapping regulations. I mean, a lot of discussion about utility mapping in general, I'm sure, but a little bit of regulations as well. The agenda, actually, there's some Zoom specifics first. So you'll be muted during the webinar, but you can use the Q&A function. It's located at the bottom of the webinar window if you want to ask questions. We're going to try and monitor those in the background, and if we can, we'll insert them into the discussion. All the questions and answers are visible to all participants. Okay, just so you're aware. Simple agenda, an introduction, our panel discussion, and a summary of where we see the future of our industry. Okay. Here's your panel. We're really proud to be joined by some industry experts today, and I'm going to give each of them a moment to introduce themselves. We're going to go from left to right, no particular order, just left to right. So, Mike, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, my name is Mike Twohig. I'm a subsurface utility mapping director at DGT Associates. We're a Boston-based firm, but we do complete projects around the U.S. for strategic clients. And we are a Kontur customer. We're a very big fan that the technology has improved our processes, and honored to be a part of the excellent panel that you have here today, colleagues and friends. So it's again, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Mike. And Greg?
Morning. My name is Greg Jeffries. I'm the Utility Division Director for Clearline. We operate primarily here in the U.S. and the southwestern U.S. territory, but we also operate in Dubai and Saudi Arabia as well. We have projects over there. And very pleased to be here today. Thank you for the invite and looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. And Sam?
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name's Sam Wiffen. I am a director and founder. I've actually just stepped down and liberated not being CEO, sort of moving into a strategic role. But founder of Reveal. We're a subsurface utility technology company sort of based in Australia and New Zealand, but operate all around the world, providing data processing services, visualization software for underground utilities. But come from the trenches. Come from putting paint on the ground. And it's been great to have a relationship with Kontur over the years and talk around the future of technology when it comes to mapping the underground. Thanks for the invite.
Hey, thanks, guys. All right, let's move on. I'm going to host this. My name is Paul Collins. I'm going to provide questions to generate some conversation. All right, but also keep an eye on your contributions. If I can, like I say, I'll try and include your topics or questions. I'm hoping to keep the discussion as organic as possible without interfering too much. Okay, so if it's blowing, we're just going to keep going, right? There's no point in stopping the conversation. And the panelists are free to share examples to bolster their discussion. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing so that that's open, and we can start the conversation. The first question really is about the challenges. So, what do you think the primary challenges are that are restricting the growth of our industry, and how can they be addressed?
Well, let me jump right in. I think a couple of the primary challenges, at least here in the United States, is the lack of I'll say regulation or the lack of requirement for what we do.
Right.
I think we're all pretty aware that Colorado and Pennsylvania are really the only states that have some legislation that mandates SUE or subsurface utility mapping in general. I think if we had wider adoption, and if we had 50-state adoption, if you will, of a law similar to what Colorado has, certainly our industry would explode pretty exponentially. But I think it would also lend itself to the idea that with a better overall design with less utility conflicts and hopefully, less damages would occur. But I think that remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, from my perspective, Greg is absolutely right. We see, a climate where we're actually regressing. So I know SUE, the traditional term for our locating and mapping in the U.S., there's great adoption through the Mid-Atlantic states, even here in Florida. In some other locations, it's very good. But in, say, New England, where we're our primarily focus for our clients that did use 25 years ago did hire companies to do SUE are now actually going back to the old practice of risk transfer management, where they make the contractor still responsible, and you see less and less utility locating done by the major AEC players. And like we said, the only thing that changes that is what Greg said. You need to have that law in place. So we want to see more legislation. We want to see more legal requirements for people to do the minimum standard of care. So I think that our biggest threat is the culture where you can get away with it if you can. And the only thing that holds your feet to the fire is having that legislation in place. And we're not seeing the changes like Colorado did enough parts of the U.S.
Mm.
True.
Yeah.
I think
suppose-
Colorado's legislation, it was a good start. It's certainly not perfect, but it was a very good start. And in some of the things that I think were very good that Colorado put in place were, for instance, the 10-day sue ticket, if you will. So that folks are required to provide records within that 10-day time window. Either that or they're required to go out and place some marks on the ground in lieu of providing records to you, which I think is, one of the things that certainly in our industry, I know that we struggle with. We struggle with the availability of records. We struggle with the folks willing to provide records. I know Michael, I would imagine you've run into similar situations, I'm sure, about folks claiming certain proprietary exclusions and reasons, including national security, why they can't provide you the records for their utility installations and so on.
Mm.
We've definitely seen that not only in the US and also globally around that last point, where in some countries they're sort of hiding behind this critical infrastructure legislation, saying, "Oh, we can't share this information about critical infrastructure," and then you go, "Well, actually, it's a misrepresentation of what that legislation says." Because by the act of not sharing it, you're actually increasing the risk to that critical infrastructure by increased damages. And they can look at the nefarious will that might occur by someone, the perceived risk of someone getting that information. It's nowhere near the amount of actual damage that happens to that critical infrastructure on a daily basis. The regulation, I think, is like one of those interesting things, and I totally agree. And it's a bit of a shame that we do have to rely on it, because it's really evidenced by it's the only really effectual way to actually get some traction. But you'd hope the industry would have sort of realized the value and realized the reason to do this sort of work. And I think understanding that root cause is super important if we are going to actually drive the regulation a lot more, because it comes down to what's the value? Why would a state or a country implement that regulation? It's either because we don't have enough data or statistics, or the return on investment off the back of why you would do these sorts of things. And I talk around the paradox of prevention a lot, right? You invest money. Let's take Sue, for example. You invest money to prevent a whole lot of risks from occurring. The best case scenario is that nothing happens.
Mm-hmm.
And humans don't like that. We kind of, where's the thing that I bought? And you're like, well, no, you just bought a whole lot of stuff that didn't happen. And you're like, oh, I don't really like that. We're quite consumer driven. But because we don't measure the pain a lot, we don't measure accurately the amount of utility strikes, we don't accurately measure the root cause of project delays to back towards utility information. We don't have that sort of wealth of data and statistics and what the impact would be. And there's phenomenal international studies that are happening and coming out more and more, which is great. but we don't have that sort of real temporal understanding on project performance to then drive why that legislation would occur. The legislation is the stick. The carrot would be, it makes good business sense, so I'm going to go and spend the money and do that.
Yeah.
Totally agree that we have to have that legislation, but it's just a shame. But I think we've got a responsibility to kind of drive some of that data and those case studies to help shift and create more of that sort of regulatory push.
Yep. Well, what amazed me is a few years ago, I was the moderator on a panel at the International LiDAR conference in Denver. And so the topic in the track was regarding utilities, and there was the person from the Colorado DOT was there. And in the lead-up discussion before we began the presentations, I said, congratulations that you got, Colorado got a law. And I said, but how the hell did you do it? Compared with the rest of the states, we have very little momentum to get the state legislator to follow suit. And I was surprised the answer was that the contractors were the one that drove it, not industry experts, not some kind of studies. It wasn't a horrific accident. Contractors got tired of big AEC, the engineering and consultants that spend 2 years designing a project and turn around and put the first page of the contract document says the contractor is responsible for finding all utilities on the project in the first 30 days. Of course, that's when they're trying to get set up and ready for construction, but they give all of the risk to the contractor, and they're not the most qualified person to do this type of work. So, I mean, they do have some great staff on board these days, but again, it's the driving force was in Colorado was contractors saying, it's your job. You designed the project. You did the survey. You did the environmental and geotechnical investigation. Now finish the project and give us something that's constructible, feasible to design and build in the time and the budget we have for it. So I think we have to follow suit, but unfortunately we don't see that. I'm sure, Greg, you agree with that comment.
Yeah. The contractors need to have a reasonable expectation that the project can be built the way that it's designed.
Yeah, like how completely logical was that?
Yeah.
Like,
it needs to have a feasibility.
So reasonable.
Yeah, and
really
but that all lends back to the idea that, like Michael's getting at, or he illuminated here, was that the putting that onus back on the contractor basically is almost saying, from the engineering side, we don't know whether this job is constructible or not. All we know is that we have a project here, whatever, within a right of way, and we have some stuff that needs to go in the ground, and we drew it here, but whether or not it can actually go there is anybody's guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how did they price this? How did they price the project in the first place? Because they're just guessing, really just guessing. It's a huge risk financially.
Well, an interesting point off the back of Mike's observation around like the contractor-driven thing. I think if we look at the bellwethers or like key indicators as to where you would see that shift is the contractual models. In New Zealand and some other, where the predominant sort of infrastructure spend comes from public, you see a lot of apathy, like public entities, like government entities, state-owned enterprises. There's a lot of apathy, and the risk is not shifted down towards contractor, it's shifted back towards customer. So you don't actually see that. That's really where the pain should be driven from. And then you've also got this sort of challenge where sometimes public entities, their mechanism as central government is to fund economies, which means there's a dichotomy with actually getting value for money when you're trying to spend budget. So there's a challenge. But interestingly enough, like say Singapore, for example, all of the risk is pushed down on the contractor, and contractors are getting multi-channel radar units, not because they want to become utility surveyors. They're doing that because they're trying to manage the risk that they're going to hit when they actually start to do the construction phase as well. So I wouldn't say that that's been driven from the contracting side, but it's kind of an interesting thing when we look at where regulation might come from or innovation. We follow the contractual models and the way that a lot of the risk is kind of pushed on. I mean, risk is the intention of why we do this from a SU perspective, from a utility surveying perspective, but it's just an interesting observation as to where it probably can be driven from.
I think there was a number of years ago, and I don't remember the year of the study, but I want to say it was late 90s, maybe early 2000s. The American Society of Value Engineers did a study that indicated that 14% of all the construction dollars, at least here in the US, are for risk. And that, so if you think about it, so 14 cents for every dollar was plugged into that contract just for the risk factor associated with it. And I think that certainly that number can be mitigated, by doing effective design, right? And that, and to me, includes a full SU or SUM scope, right, to adequately document and depict where the existing utilities are so that the design becomes more effective, right? And you end up with a constructible job with minimal conflict situations, right? So that risk dollar gets squeezed down, right? So there's more value back to the entity, the owner entity, whether it's the provincial government, the local government, federal government, so on, for what their value for what they spent their money on. What value did they get? And were they just, or did they just in fact piss away 14% of their money on unnecessary risk?
Yep. Yeah, and that risk is always, I don't mean to stand my own opinions on this one, but the risk is always on how much is it going to cost us to relocate something or the design has to change. But what about the risk to the people that are actually breaking ground? And that was something that got my interest in subsurface utility mapping originally. It wasn't necessarily what has become our industry now, which is the design phase and creating something in that stage of a project, which I think is critical. But my life began in this industry of marking up in front of somebody that was breaking ground and staying ahead of them. And so my main priority was to make sure they did not hurt themselves during the process. And that's where my passion comes from. But that risk is never really looked at. That risk of hurting someone, I think, is also something that we should really be focusing on. Not just project cost, but also cost to the individuals that are working out.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, Paul, we actually don't work for contractors because of the fact that if you're standing, whether it's bringing in a Kontur system or bringing in a pipe locator and a crew, if that machine is right behind you, it's already, the bullet's fired from the gun. You're just trying to prevent stuff. It's way too late, and we don't engage in those projects. We won't actually bid on a project like that. It always constitutes an emergency on your part to stay ahead of the contractor, which means that you don't get to do diligence. You don't get to do the historical review of a site. And so we never really want to be in that position. Now, in the US, I find that I call it the Springer Spaniel approach, where every time I talk to a contractor and says, you do know you're supposed to have a pipe locator and protect the workforce, from injury with utilities in accordance with the 811 and all the state legislation you have. But they don't realize it's their responsibility. If they hit something, they say, well, it wasn't on the drawing, so I'm going to blame the engineer and the surveyor on the project. And that finger pointing has shown, there's court precedent to show from the accident in Walnut Creek, California in 2004, that actually everybody's to blame when you do get people killed and hurt. So it's everybody's responsibility to do it, but you're in a very bad position. And unfortunately, if you look at half of the pictures out there, whether, I don't care, any of the big manufacturers, there's always a great picture of the guy with a CAT system or a device, and he's standing in front of an excavator. And I laughed my ass off going, what the hell are you doing? It's like minutes from disaster, because those contractors want to push, and make money. It's the last line of defense. It's a seatbelt in a car. It's not putting any new high tech onto a vehicle to say, how do you stop these incidents? So we only put ourselves in a position where we're ahead of the project. We're in the preliminary or design phase of a project. You map it out completely, and then you take your very good document that goes into construction. The contractor can look at the document and look at the paint in the ground from the grade 811 responders and say, do these things match? And then I can do my informed decisions, whether I bring in a vac truck or anything else, or dig safely around existing infrastructure to help people. Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. So we stay in that very small margin of clients that appreciate that approach, but it's not changing fast enough, in our opinion.
Yeah, and
Well,
that's
so
a comment. That's sorry, Sam. That's a comment from Tuna in who's attending the webinar,
yeah.
and we know him very well. It's a comment of his. It hasn't changed over last 25 years that he's been involved in this. He's not seen much changes are too slow in that
Yeah.
in our industry, right?
Yeah, well, we go back to the cover of the article we wrote. DGT allowed me to spend some time keeping on writing for publications, but one of them was the Culver City in 1976, and the transportation agency said, "Hey, the contractor is going to find all utilities," and they put it in language for the contracting, and the contractor didn't do what he was supposed to do. He just went around doing his project like he thought he was going to do, and they struck the gasoline line, and they basically cremated pedestrians on the street that day.
Yeah, yeah.
And today the same regulations and the best risk transfer practice by these engineering firms and transportation groups is still happening. So have we learned anything since 1976? In my opinion, no. So we do less and less of some of these conferences because we're not seeing that change. So
Well, probably what we have learned is that despite all of the evidence, there's no appetite or traction for change. So whatever we're doing, we can't continue doing that. And like on your point, and I've got a sort of concept to run past everyone on this, all the way back to yours, Paul, as well, and the digger thing. I remember talking to a contractor on site, and I said, what do you think would be the number one thing that we could do to stop utility strikes? He says, you're doing it. Like, what do you mean? He goes, by mapping the utilities, you inform the design. You put us out of harm's way. If the gas main's, 30 feet away from where it is on the existing records, we don't even go near that if you've mapped it, because the design accommodates for that. And that is the true essence of safety by design practice. Like, hey, we're going to inform this and assess the risk and make sure that we design out of that. And I'm sort of tracking this across all of our customers and contacts and friends and the community around the world around statistics. And I'm big on stats, and we all are in this world to a degree. We're finding probably about on average that 66% of all utilities in the ground are on existing records, all within CUI or the closeness of where the record is to where the unknown is, that you can't say it's actually that. So you could double count that a bit. So if you know that, let's say statistically that's the majority, right? And I say this, I used to work for a large engineering consulting firm for 7 years and run design teams as well. You go, if you design just using the existing records and it's 66% of all the utilities underground are existing records, it is a certainty you're going to have utility strikes, delays, redesign, construction. Therefore, if you only use the existing records, you are negligent. Effectively,
Yeah.
you've got a duty of care as the engineer to accommodate for risk for your principal, your customer, your client. If you just use existing records, you are negligent. And it sounds, evocative and forceful, but I think we kind of need to get to that point. This is where we get insurance involved, and we're doing some exploration there to try and figure out what are these different sort of mechanisms to drive this all. But I think as an industry, if we could kind of track a lot of those statistics and put that up front, it's empirical evidence that, why would you not accommodate for that?
Yeah, I just don't think that there's enough push. And it needs to be legislatively, unfortunately. It needs to be legislated. It needs to be mandated by law. And then, that whole paradigm will shift pretty dramatically. I'd love to tell you, I mean, I've read some statistics about Colorado's law and whether or not it has impacted damages. To say that it's lower damages, according to what I've read anyway, it hasn't significantly impacted the number of damages. But at the same time, I think it's kind of a misnomer in a way, because the amount of infrastructure work has been steadily increasing, and the damages are kind of at a level.
Yeah.
They're kind of leveled off, but the amount of infrastructure work is increasing. So I think over the long run, yeah, it's going to demonstrate that damages are down and so on, but certainly it's created a much more effective design in the areas where it has been utilized, and it has shown that there's been some expediency in how some of these projects go that have had a full SUE workup on the project, and the design was put together based on that full SUE information, that they were able to expedite the project. And everybody, to me, everybody makes money at that point, right? The contractors are in a better position. They made money. They're able to move on to the next job. They didn't have pieces of equipment that were sitting parked waiting for a resolution to a conflict. And the owner, when that happens, of course, the project owner is footing the bill for that until at some point later on when it ends up in a courtroom, and then and then those costs get shared to somebody else. So
Yeah, but at the end of the day, Greg, you and I both know that we don't even move a decimal point in a project. The fee for our services, and yet, I'm always very critical, if you talk with any of the big engineering firms that are behind these designs, they never forsake the environmental investigation. They never forget about the geotech investigation, but they 90%, 99% of the time in our New England, they forget about the subsurface utility investigation.
right.
So, unless you're an idiot and you don't have internet connection at your, glass tower office, where the hell have you been for the last 30 years reading about all the return of investment from the good work that practitioners all over the country have? And it's not like you can't find practitioners to bid on these projects like we had, 30 years ago when I was doing this work. There was no other competition. So people felt like I have to use you because there's nobody else. These days, they're just not using anybody. And there's a lot of good competition. There's a lot of good practitioners out there, and they're just avoiding it. And the only thing that's avoiding it is the fact that nobody's holding them accountable for their mistakes. So, and we're also, kind of critical of the industry with the, the CGA, for example. Greg and I always loved those type of events, but we've stopped participating because it was a great way for us to have some adult beverages with some of our peers. But besides that, in the US, we don't go hunting the laggards that keep on breaking utilities. There's no record, there's no statistical analysis, there's no data capture to say who's breaking all the utilities and how to drive it to zero. So after years of listening to how do you get damages down to zero, well, it's pretty easy. Chase the laggards. Who's breaking the utilities? But in the US, even our DIRT report, right? You can correct me, Greg, if I'm wrong, but it's a voluntary participation that says I'm going to report an accident. Well, whoever reports I'm an idiot and our guys broke a utility line. There's not many people want to be honest about that. So do we really know in the US what the real true number of damages and how you get to zero? You're basically removing enough of parts of the formula to get to zero, so it'll never be accountable. So, how do you get there? I think we know how it gets there. It's special interests, it's the lobbyist, and it's the people that make sure that SUM and SUE and the standard of care becomes law in each of the states, and they protect their interests by saying, let's never make that a law in my state. So,
yeah, no, Michael, you're 100% correct. The DIRT report is completely voluntary. It is geared to be sanitized so that there's no finger pointing type evidence as to the who was involved situation. It's very sanitized in that regard. The idea is, in theory, I guess, to report the statistical occurrences and so on, and what the at least immediate effects of that occurrence were. I think some of the things that we miss out of that are what are the long-term impacts from some of those things. There's nothing that's tracking how many of these cases ended up in court and what were those costs and settlements associated. Nothing tracks that. Nothing tabulates that. And I think that number certainly is ridiculous. I mean, I know from the cases that I am retained in to analyze and make cases testify in, I've seen these settlements and they are monstrous. And nobody keeps a tab on that, because if they did and they realized that, we show, the thing that everybody refers to here in the US is the 1999 report from Dr. Liu, right? And it points to that formula that he came up with of $4.62 for every
Yeah.
dollar spent, right?
Yeah.
And that's really the only, I'll say, nationally recognized statistical analysis that we have. There's a few regional statistical analysis. I know the Florida DOT did one, Pennsylvania did one.
Only $2 one with Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So there's some regional stuff that, but I think none of that really takes into account some of the other things that what the long-term implications. What happened when some of these cases actually went to court, and what were those settlements? Because I think if you analyze that 462 goes up exponentially.
Yeah. And so we've been dealing with a couple of insurers to try and find that, like figure that out. I've talked to one insurer and they said for every millionth claim, and there's probably about 1.5 million per year, it's $100 million plus claim. So the average is like reasonably low, but then you have these big spikes, right? And it's an interesting thing when you kind of look at that sort of stats. But even, and I totally agree around the CGA, like I love the intent of what the Dirt Report's trying to do and what we're doing, but even just recently, we've had one of the largest sort of entities that submitted all the numbers in there to is no longer volunteering to do so. So you've got such a small data pool from the Dirt Report that doesn't really give you any sort of indicators as to what that is. And I mean, globally, and you guys love to hear your thoughts on it, whether we think probably about 50% of utility strikes are reported. Because if you've heard anything like a storm sewer, sewage, you're just going to probably, or a water lateral, you got to tie it back together and away you go again. We've seen stop signs and give way signs bent over the top of like drains to get them going again, and all sorts of horrific stuff. And Mike's point, like, why would you voluntarily do it?
Yeah.
But even just the utility strikes is like the one of probably five massive kind of pain points. And that's the most sort of tangible you can look at. If you look at construction delays, you look at the inefficiency around the data, the repeated data collection, which I know we all kind of make money from doing that repeated data collection, but if your values set, and I know your guys do, and it doesn't make sense, you go and do the same shit over and over again. Like
Yep.
Yep.
it's that's only like one thing that's very tangible. That's the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And
Yep.
like but I'm sort of, even if we did the full economic calculation and you look at some of the the University of Birmingham study that says for every dollar it's a 29 times, there's a refresh study coming out of Australia shortly that's looking at an even higher number. I don't even think the numbers matter or care to legislators to kind of shift it in the right direction. Like there's got to be something different. It's not money anymore.
Yep. Well, we throw a lot of money at different initiatives, but I've always find that some of the, people that attend these big trade shows are the biggest hypocrites. So if we really wanted to find out what the numbers are, the one person that responds to all accidents is 911. So if you have millions of dollars, why don't you give it to a fire department and said that when you have utility strikes, enter it into a database and we compensate the fire department. I mean, these guys are sitting around waiting for the next wreck. So entering a few little critical data points, or what the contractor is, they hit a gas line, at least we'd say who's hitting lines, how many lines are being hit, how many responses do we have, so we'd actually get a true picture of what's happening out there. Then you could do some analysis. I don't think you get the gene pool like you said, Sam, if you're just going to hear from a few volunteers. So you're not getting a good snapshot. So, and you're never going to figure out who the laggards are. But going back to Greg's comment, we have getting the available records from some of these big telecom companies. We have a big project that's been going on for 6 years in the Metro Boston area, and the giant telecom column company that we have in the area, which is the national one, they'll spend $1 million for the ad during the Super Bowl. but the last time they updated their utility record for the fiber was 1998. Now we're thinking there's a few more things put in the ground since 98. Not sure. I mean, maybe you slept through the telecom boom since those days, but we're not feeling that that record is really an accurate representation of what's in the ground, and we're now responsible to try and find it all. That's an enormous task for us. So it's yeah, we're kind of frustrated that we haven't moved on, and technology keeps getting better, but the culture doesn't go at the same speed.
Mhm.
But
Is there,
there's a
what types of technology or project requests are emerging that the regulations are failing to address? Because I think as practitioners, it starts off as all subsurface, and all of a sudden you start getting these requests that are also including the above ground, because utilities also are present above ground too, right? So then all of a sudden you get dragged into a slightly different scenario where you're not just looking for subsurface information. So is it, are you receiving, you know, new project requests that the regulations aren't covering at all? And is it maybe because there's a new technology that you're trying to use or that doesn't exist in the regs, or anything like that you get that's a bit unusual that's starting to emerge?
Interesting. Well, I can tell you certainly here in Texas, for instance, the great number of our SUE contracts with the Texas Department of Transportation with TxDOT, as of late now include above ground utilities. And certainly cataloging and categorizing what exists above ground. It makes a lot of sense. TxDOT, I think, is pretty proactive. They're not complete. It's not universal across the whole state. We have different districts here in the state that are some are more proactive than others, but we have those districts that are proactive, and early on in the PS&E, in fact, in the schematic design of the job, they'll want the SUE information, and they'll want this characterization of all the utilities above and below ground, because a lot of times it turns into a relocation project, and the idea that they've now identified who are these owners that are on the poles that are adjacent to the project that are going to be affected at some point in time by this project. We're going to have to compensate these folks to move their stuff out of the way. I think it's a better picture. It does, it does create some interesting questions, because sometimes it's not always easy to identify exactly who is resident on those poles above ground. That's not always easy to identify who it is underground, unless you're able to trace it to a known point where you can definitively identify that utility owner. Certainly you can identify, hey, it's a fiber optic cable, but whether or not you can, definitively identify who owns that fiber optic cable is another story.
Yeah, and things like mobile mapping, where you're collecting, LiDAR and or terrestrial. Maybe it's you're setting up a laser scanner. You get requests like this, and how do you cover that, because it's not really subsurface anymore? So is that becomes, then you're creating almost like a BIM model of above ground, and then you're trying to incorporate the same approach below ground, which is interesting. And I'm
that-
almost certain that Reveal have been involved in this or made something like that, because I know I have, and this was many years ago. And do the regulations cover for that? I don't know actually if they do.
well, two points in it. We're actually seeing more MLS type projects. You're seeing some of those entities that are very good above ground starting to move into the below ground market. And
Hmm.
for anyone, and like yourselves, Greg and Mike, who have been doing this for a long time, when it comes to the focus, we're staying focused on the underground. You have to get really, really good at capturing the ground, because everything that you hang your utility models comes from the ground. So by proxy, you become very good surveyors, in the sense that I don't really care about the above ground apart from the ground, and effectively the little islands that pop up, which are the above ground aspects from the utilities. The challenge and the BIM, triggered me a bit with the BIM comment, Paul. I've had so many projects where BIM engineers have sort of said, well, how come you're not delivering this in a BIM format? And how come we're not looking at this? And why are we not doing? I've seen a project come out of the Middle East. I reckon we should catch up around it. It's like specifying LOD 500 for underground utilities. So you're going, okay, that's going to be $9 billion because we're going to have to suck everything up and scan it to millimeter accuracy. It comes down to the like in the lexicon of BIM, really focusing on what's the loin, so the level of information needed. There are two international standards that I'm aware of and use quite a bit that actually reference BIM in the underground sense, and that's the Australian standard AS 5488 talks in parts 2 around how you deliver that digital data in a BIM compliant format, and also the CIC underground standard out of Hong Kong talks around BIM for underground. But it also acknowledges that it's an emergent space, that it's tricky, and that we're trying to figure out. And the same LODs that you require for above ground BIM models are not relevant to below ground. And it comes down to what is the information that you need, and is really good. And I encourage people to go and have a look at those standards and reach out, and I can kind of take you through those. But there's no sort of like broad brush BIM approach you shouldn't apply a broad brush BIM approach to the underground. I mean, I could talk around BIM in terms of the misrepresentation of the word building is being used as a verb instead of a noun. Oh, sorry, noun instead of a verb, because for the building process. But that aside, the one thing I probably do say as a benefit, though, in terms of these mass above ground data capture processes, is actually shining quite a bit of a light on how poor the infrastructure is. I've had big major landscape architecture firm like works around the world saying, man, these projects, we get these phenomenal 3D models of the above ground, and then we try and attach like these rudimentary underground things, looks like crown drawings. And they're going, oh, and I mean, even from a visual sense, you're like, and we know it when we see all these sort of like very straight sort of like vanilla type utility models that don't actually consider like the 400-volt cables that kind of snake around. I think that's where I'm seeing lots of customers and partners and entities are actually starting to kind of shine a bit more, because they say, look, there's a really good, accurate, referenceable, mapped utility model that we can hang underneath this very, same equivalent above ground model.
Yeah, I mean, 10 years ago, I was very optimistic. I mean, we were merging LiDAR data sets and starting to make our 3D model. But unfortunately, now that's become Star Trek, because, customers are still very reluctant to pay for a 2D, to go out and trace and locate. So, yes, everybody wants to be on Star Trek, but, that's not where we are in the world today. If you don't want to pay for it, then how the heck does Jeff and I in the US say how we're going to be able to do that 3D model? We call it subsurface information modeling, because we think we're in a whole different space than the above ground. And where it is very easy to scan above ground terrestrial LiDAR, wearable devices, even the phone now can do the scanning. The underground is still just one of those domains that, how do you have enough of data points to show that it's an authentic 3D model underground versus something that's aesthetic? Because we get a lot of requests and we're like, how am I going to get the data points to show the proper X, Y, and Z of all of the bends and twists in this underground infrastructure? Because if you're going to give that 3D model to a designer and he exports that out, if it's not completely accurate, then you expose yourself to another risk as the land, the utility surveyor, to say, hey, there was mistakes in the 3D model. So we're faced with a dilemma, and I'm sure Greg faces the same thing with his 3D model behind, is how do you have enough of data points to be able to say this is an accurate subsurface information model?
Right. And I think certainly you're 100% correct, Michael. One of the things that we make sure that we caution folks on is, even though, we could create a very comprehensive 3D model from the data that we're able to collect, we always indicate that we still call it quality level B, first off, although we are able to represent vertices to a degree. There's certainly some significant drawbacks to standing behind what those vertical issues are, but things like Kontur and a couple of the other manufacturers that are out there, certainly Impulse, Raptor, blah blah blah, Mala, so on and so forth. That ability to collect pretty accurate data and to be able to depict it. I like to call it, by the way, CIM, construction information modeling, because it kind of, to me, encapsulates all aspects of it: above ground, below ground. If we're constructing something, it's CIM. However, to stand behind any of this stuff is actually very tricky, Michael, because we can't represent that we captured 100% of everything that's underground. We can't do that, despite the level of technology that we're using and the care and effort that we put into it in order to try and capture all this information. We can't represent that we're covering 100%, and we can't represent that what we're providing is 100% accurate unless we've done, we've exposed it, which, that's an issue. It's a sticky issue. And certainly with the above ground systems that are out there, with the mobile LiDAR, terrestrial LiDAR, hell, even drone LiDAR at this point, the accuracies that they can achieve with that are significant, and our accuracies pale in comparison, because there's still so much stuff that we don't know.
That's because there's an interpretation step that we have to do that you don't with the above ground.
Yeah.
It's like Google Street View, right? They go out with a sensor, take a photo, and the consumer of that deliverable is whoever goes on to Google Street View, and we do the interpretation with our eyes because we see in photoreal. If we do a capture with a multi-channel radar, we have to do the interpretation and then present that. And we take the liability because we're doing the interpretation, not the end consumer. And that's where you run into those issues. And like, say, for example, using PAS 128 out of the UK, good for sort of, I think that's an interesting standard that's driving towards trying to achieve some of those confidence levels around how you can articulate a vertice from, and confidence is a huge word in our industry that needs to be kind of folded in. But yeah, I mean, I find that's a really interesting thing, that with the paradigm of the underground, we have to do the interpretation and we take liability for doing that interpretation, whereas above ground, it's automated and the interpretation isn't required because all you're doing is following a duty care process. I've done this with the sensor and I've got this QA/QC process. Here's the end deliverable based on these requirements.
Yeah, I know I'm going to annoy Kent Martin, but the reason we're a Kontur customer is because when we look at how we're going to move into a 3D world, how do we have higher reliability on the Z portion of our utility mapping? Instead of investing in vac trucks, I'm allergic to vac trucks. After 40 years of being around them, I just can't stand the sound of it. But we have a lot of great vendors out there that can get us, exposed at the X, Y, and the Z through test holes. But if we can go back with the radar data and see a profile of a pipe from our examiner software, then we can actually go back and recalibrate, said we got excellent Z values, we can reprocess the data, and we have very good data points along these utilities with a high confidence to know that what we are putting into our subsurface information model will be better. So that was our goal all along, to get to that point. And that's why we're a customer and a part of this, because we believe that's the way forward for us.
And we always love you, Mike.
I don't get a Christmas card. I don't know.
Note that one. I think we could probably talk about this for hours. We might have to have a follow-up. But I think with 10 minutes out, I think we should maybe finish with, which is almost impossible, but let's try and finish with some kind of prediction, right? Considering cumulatively we probably have, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 years of experience here on the panel, and I think where do we see the next 5 years? Are we going to, just in general, is the utility mapping industry, are we going to break through some of this legislation or regulatory issue, or are we going to be finding things are more collaborative? How are we going to how are we going to move forward? Is there going to be sharing of data? Is there going to be more technological things that we can rely upon? This black box kind of idea. Where are we heading? What do you reckon?
That's a very loaded question, man.
Yeah. I'll
But
Where are we
I'll
headed?
finish.
where are we
You
heading?
go,
Yeah,
Greg.
where are we heading? Where could we be in 5 years? I mean, where would we like to be, and where will we actually be, do you think?
Well, I think, right now, I'd like to see, where we could go with some new technology that, I think we all know that, I mean, the technology that we're currently using, pipe locators, ground penetrating radar. I mean, these are certainly not new. They're
Yep.
decades old technology. There's obviously refinement. There's leaps forward and with regard to interpretation, the ability to refine these things. But I don't. I'd love to see something come out that answers some of the questions that we are having difficulty answering right now. Things like finding non-conductive or non-metallic type utilities in strata where ground penetrating radar is ineffective.
Hmm.
Those type of technologies would be wonderful.
Yep.
And I don't see, there's been a few, claims about some of those technologies, in the last several years. Sensit Technologies came out with the APL, the acoustic pipe locator. I think, folks can weigh in on either side of whether or not it's effective. And I know that there's a new one out there, I think called Solaris Technologies. I haven't seen it personally yet, but I hear that they're having some decent results with that. I'm interested to see how that pans out.
Hmm.
Technology wise, I mean, I don't know. I'd love to see somebody come up with a new idea, but I think everything that we're using is just refinements of decades old technologies.
Yep.
I mean, shout out to the Delta G guys in the UK around the gravity stuff that they're looking at, which is still very, very new and true. And I know there's some towable EML arrays that are being developed in trial, which looks pretty interesting because then you've got two, towable sensors kind of telling you the same thing. But probably for me, it's in the data side, and probably to your point as well, Mike, and whether we kind of like it or not, some of the computer vision stuff that we're seeing, like all those data points on, hey, look, I've seen that hyperbola based on this confidence and building those mass data models to try and drive that. And that's something that and it's been awesome working with like a little bit on testing, sort of just testing, trying to figure stuff out. Like how do we start to look at it in a different way is there, but probably machine learning and AI, I'd say is going to be a big space and one for us to kind of keep our eyes on because it's you've got the problem is the status quo bias. Like a lot of people, if they're using existing records, everyone's used to the existing records, and therefore by proxy, that is the best information because that's all we've really ever had in the past. As soon as you assert something else which is different, you kind of approach it with a different bias, but people believe it if it's digital or it's used to inform a design. And if it's throwing you some false information, which, hallucinations, which AI does, what's the impact of that? And then we're going to sort of demonize that if it's not really right. I mean, GPR as a tool followed that because it hasn't been regulated or licensed that well by operators over the years. The data space is going to be huge. And to probably answer two of the questions in here, I'm hopeful that that's what drives it, right? Because it comes back to money. It comes to the financials, not in the terms of like dropping the cost for doing utility surveying or mapping, but because we're finding massive value add for the asset owners, we can actually find, hey, look, we've eliminated water leaks or we've identified these things. We've found a whole lot of optimal route solutions or we've been able to feed data back into what you're doing and reduce your risk. I kind of look at it rather than sort of reduction in cost. If we can actually look at the financial gain that a lot of these customers or secondary customers or stakeholders can get off the back of this, it's actually going to drive the industry a lot more because they say, oh, this is great. We're actually finding more value from doing this work beyond the risk mitigation. We're actually finding an increased value. Let's actually do more of this work. That sort of pushes beyond the reliance on legislation because that's
Yeah.
the lagging indicator, right? And if we can get the market to drive that because they want to do that, they get a financial gain or whatever the value transaction is, it's going to be with some value add around the data and how they either make more money or get less risk.
Yeah. From my perspective, I mean, and I know Greg would agree with me, we would like to see more states, adopt the same type of Colorado law and said, okay, we're going to make this mandatory, that all projects are going to begin with at least a QLB survey to make it a better project. It's going to be better constructible. Contractors will benefit. There will be less loss of life. So hopefully that will happen. But we really don't see the fundamentals of utility locating in the U.S. 811 is going to stay the same for a long time. We don't see that changing, and not that we have a problem with that, but it's still a good line of defense as you get into construction, and it's just the fundamentals of the way our industry is in the U.S. But for us, I think mobile mapping has to be a huge step forward, and the more sensors we can put on these platforms, the better. I mean, that's always been my goal, is to get, not only the radar system. We've always been playing with LiDAR on the roof, thermal imaging on the roof, 360 imaging, and data capture, just like ImageBox out of France, where we can collect so much more data, and eventually that could be an autonomous vehicle. I mean, we're seeing, we're not too far away from having these electric vehicles where we have all the clean power we need for running sensors. It can drive around and collect data continuously, and then you can actually do time capture of, say, hey, very large parts of the world that maybe companies like Reveal will be able to say, hey, we got a data set for you for the entire county or city or district. And, you can pull from that. Maybe asset owners will say, well, that's a great data set. Maybe I can update my GIS records with this value information and not only understand my asset, but what are the other assets around me as we have to deal with it. The one thing that came for us in recent years is not the change of regulations that are changing our industry. It's that climate change is actually driving clients to request us to do what we've always done, but for a different reason. It's not a capital program. It's not for, a new building project. It's not for a new transmission line. We're seeing several of our customers saying, what's going on with my infrastructure and how am I going to defend myself against these natural disasters? And so we have crews actively working, and a lot of our pursuits this week alone have been saying it's driven because of not finding the asset. It's going, what do I need to know about the built world to protect myself for future events? So, but I do think robotics and some of those things are going to change a lot. I've always had a desire to have if we do these great maps, whether Greg or your project, Sam, that, if you already have a great project, why not have instead of a person out there in the travel way, because that's one of the big issues for us is the safety of our crews on roadways. Why don't we have a robot remarking out these data? One of the questions from Kent and Paul was, how do we, improve it in regulations? Well, a robot can go out there and remark all the things that we've already captured.
Yeah.
I don't like painting on the ground, but a robot could do a very good job of remarking it for contractors, painting it under the ground for excavators. Maybe machine control will eventually take that over. But there is a lot of things we could change. And I think AI is going to be fantastic for us for better processing of the data. I mean, I've been looking at radar data for the best part of 30 years, and I think I'm still an idiot when it comes to reading that data. You really need to be so skilled. So having AI in the background to say, hey, we're seeing more than you've only seen 30% of what you could have extracted from this data set. So I think that part is going to be the exciting part for us, working with somebody like Sam to say, we've collected data, now let's process it as fast as possible, and let's see how it compares with the multiple data sets from other sensors, whether it's EM that's a mobile system or some of these other technologies.
We are absolutely with you, Mike, on that one.
Mhm.
All right. Okay.
right.
We are watching the clock. So I'm going to cut us off, even though I don't really want to, but I will. I just want to say thank you to you guys as our panel, and the subject matter expertise is enormous, and I think we could probably have a second discussion on this subject, and also to thank everyone for joining us today. In 2025, we have a new solution called Kontur Orbit. You're going to be hearing about it a little bit more and more as we start to get closer to release. It's going to be you can in fact, scan the QR code and sign up to receive some more information about this service. It is going to be bringing more of this kind of automation and intelligence to the subsurface, extracting from your radar data without having to do a huge amount of manual interpretation. The other part of this, we are also sponsoring a new web platform called surveyhub.ai. I think it's really worth checking this out and signing up. It's a platform where you can post projects, bid for projects globally, not just in your own countries, but it's really nice and has lots of functionality that is increasing. And you can even take parts of a job, have someone do your radar data in another place and do other parts on site, things like this. So I think you should sign up to that. It's an interesting one for the survey community in general, but also for utility mapping. You can come and see us at the following couple of events that are coming up at the beginning of 2025. So we'll be at the TRB seminar in Washington, DC in January, and then we'll follow that up at Geo Week in Denver, Colorado. And of course, if you're interested in our products, let us know. Contact us through sales@kontur.tech. But also, I know the guys don't want to promote their own businesses. That wasn't the discussion for today. But also, reach out to our panelists, be part of the conversation, and let's connect our industry together. And there we can make some serious changes. Thank you very much, and we will see you next time. And once again, thank you to our panels today, and we will see you soon.
Very good.
Appreciate it.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much.
And Michael,
Good chat,
Ken,
guys.
thank you all.
That was awesome. Thank you.